We're back here tonight again for another lesson of Should Christians Go to War? A look at the early Christian attitude to war. This is now lesson 5. If we go back and review a little bit of what we've talked about, the evidence from the teachings of Jesus show that he was a very peaceful, gentle man. He didn't use violence of any kind. We looked at a few possible exceptions to that, but showed that when he makes that whip, of course it's just being used on sheep and cattle. No need for it to be used in people in the text of John. And we saw that he taught his disciples to follow those same principles, right? Jesus taught them to love their enemies, not just their neighbors, right? Not just themselves. Not to resist evil, not to stand against it violently, but to turn the other cheek, etc., etc. We looked at those verses, and we saw that the early church understood that very plainly, and they held very tightly to those principles, and they showed a very strong disapproval for warfare of any kind, right? That they were not going to be involved in that. They did not participate in it. They looked down on a lot of the They looked back, on a lot of the violence that had been done over the years, the bloodshed. They saw it as the instigated by demons and just horrible things, right? And war is terrible. Everyone, I think, agrees about that. But Christians had a particular distaste for it. So we looked at that and all the evidence on that side, right? So tonight, though, we're going to kind of change gears, and we're going to look at some ways in which the early church accepted war, right? Everything from talking about it and using analogies and things like that, all the way to actually participating in it. We might not get through all of this material tonight. It's a very long lesson. I think we're going to have to stop partway through and continue like we did for the other side in an extra lesson. So let's start with the early Christian acceptance of war. So the number one thing is the use of military terms and phrases, right, that illustrate religious life. This is how it kind of gets started, right? We saw the example that they lived for all these centuries, right? But when you go back to the New Testament itself, we find the Apostle Paul using military metaphors, right, for the Christian life. We are familiar with those, right? He talks about the armor of God, the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith, the sword of the Spirit, the helmet of salvation, right? This is military equipment, right, put into the Christian life. But, is Paul talking about actual metal armor, bronze and steel and wood and leather? Or, he's talking about spiritual things. He's making an analogy here. He talks in another place about weapons of righteousness on the right and the left, right? So we've got this military metaphor of Christians wielding weapons, but again, they're not bronze and iron. They are righteousness that we're wielding, right? He talks about his companions being fellow soldiers, fellow captives, right? These are our military and war metaphors. He compares warfare to, he compares human warfare on the one side to a Christian struggle against evil angelic powers, right? This is in the section of the armor of God, right? We're at battle between these forces of darkness in the realms, right? The heavenly realms. You look at what he writes to Timothy. He tells him to be a good soldier of Jesus Christ, right? So, wow, okay, that seems to be, that's a be a good soldier. Wow, but in the context, what is it? He's using the military as an example, right? When you get enrolled in the military and you're in the army, you don't get mixed up in civilian affairs, right? You have a commission. You have a duty to perform, right? So you don't just involve yourself in the regular things of everyday life because you have a special place. Timothy is a good soldier of Christ. He's to perform the work of an evangelist. He's to, be prepared in season and out of season. These sorts of things, right? So there's a military metaphor there, but the calling is entirely different. And Paul goes out of his way 2 times when he's making these references to show that he's not talking about earthly warfare, right? He says, though we walk in the flesh, we do not serve as soldiers according to the flesh. For the weapons of our military service are not those of the flesh, but powerful through God for the demolition of strongholds, demolishing theories and every rampart thrown up against the knowledge of God. All right, notice that. We are in the flesh, we're walking in the flesh, but that's not how we serve as soldiers, right? That's not where our work is, right? Our weapons are not fleshly weapons. Our weapons are not physical weapons of the body, right? They're there for demolishing theories and things against the knowledge of God, right? This strongholds of opinion, and we're breaking down these philosophies of men and bringing in the truth of God. That's where our weapons are, right? He also says our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the world potentates of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. So take up the armor of God, right? Our battle is going to require righteousness, right? Peace, truth, faith, the Word of God, salvation. These are the things that we need to have if we're going to battle and win against these heavenly forces, right? These wicked heavenly forces, right? Up in the sky somewhere, right? This is not a physical battle. It's a spiritual one. Now, this kind of language, Paul uses it, and he writes so much of the New Testament that you start to see more and more military language get used later on, right? As more and more writers go on, they start calling back to these references of Paul, and they start expanding on them. They start making some of their own. In the first century, in the second century, we don't see a whole lot of it, right? Maybe a couple of references like we do in Paul. But as we get into the middle of the 3rd century, right? So we're talking about the mid-200s now, on into the 300s. Whenever there's a lot of persecution, we start getting a lot of military metaphors and military language coming in, right? Because this is a fight, a spiritual fight that's now having physical consequences, because you have to strengthen yourself against the enemies that are against you, that are doing all this, right? And especially in the western half, in the Latin church, the Latin writers, they are using much more military references, right, than the ones in the East. So you can see that kind of delineation between the two different writers, Greek and Latin, or two different groups of writers, excuse me. And it's interesting, this word pagan that we use, right? We use that term today to mean non-Christian. But if you go back and you look at what paganus, which is the Latin word, what it means, right? It originally means a civilian, right? Not a soldier, right? So you've got somebody in the army and you've got a civilian. A civilian is a pagan, right? And so it's kind of very interesting that this word that we think of as non-Christian, that means civilian, right? That makes it seem kind of backwards from what we're talking about, right? Because up to this point, all we've seen is Christians not being in the army, with rare exceptions, right? And the reason that we use the word pagan today to talk about non-Christians is because of the change that happens later on, right? Because as we get up to the time of Constantine, Christians are very rare in the army, right? But in the next 100 years, from 313 up until 411, there's a massive change. And so by the time we get to the beginning of the 5th century in 411, the Roman Empire, the Roman army, was composed entirely of Christians. You were not allowed to be in the Roman army if you were not a Christian, right? So that's why the word pagan began to be used of non-Christians, right? Because Christians were in the army, non-Christians were civilians, they couldn't be in the army, they were pagans, right? And so we use that word, 1,500 years later, because of the usage of that time. But if you go back, in the centuries before that we've been talking about, it was exactly the opposite. The Christians were actually the pagans, right? They were the civilians, they weren't in the army. So this switch changes as Latin writers use more and more military metaphors, and then the church shifts into this different role in the 5th century. Now, of course, during this time we're talking about, back in the 200s, 300s, there were people that would misunderstand these metaphors, right? Okay, we're Christian soldiers, we need to be a soldier, right? And so they they would try to apply them literally, right? But when we look and see what the writers actually said, it's very clear they're just expressing some reality of spiritual warfare, right? They're not talking about actually serving as Christians. They were very clear that the use of arms, physical arms for Christians was not okay, right? They did not support that. So that's the kind of conflict that we see going on there between some of the language that they're using and the way that people might understand it if they're not listening very carefully. And then if we go into considering the wars of the Old Testament, right? So we've got military metaphors going on, but then also another way that Christians accepted war was through the Old Testament, right? And this is what we look today. We look back at the Old Testament and say, well, look at all these wars, right? But in those early centuries, it was very easy for the church to separate their code of conduct from the one that was laid down in the Old Testament, right? They didn't see any contradiction between that. Some of them did, as we'll see. But for them, the scriptures were divinely inspired, right? These were recorded history. This is what happened before. God was guiding them. God was telling them to do these things. Some of these were God-ordained battles and conquests in the case of Canaan. So that's fine, right? But it was not open for debate, right? You could talk about it. You could approve of those authors. These were sacred books. Of course it's the way it was, right? But the question is that the way it is, right? See, Christians, even though they had that high esteem for the Old Testament and they could look up to David and all these guys, they never assumed that they could do whatever the people in the Old Testament did, right? Think about it. There's a lot of things that happen in the Old Testament that we're not supposed to do. There's a lot of things that happen in the Old Testament that were against the law of Moses, right? You read throughout Genesis, all these guys are doing things, and suddenly the law comes, and all those things are against the law, right? Marrying your wife's sister, you're not supposed to do that, right? Making the firstborn son of your later wife to inherit a double portion of your inheritance and neglect the actual firstborn son of yours. You're not supposed to do that. But Jacob did that, right? So all these things that guys like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob did suddenly became against the law in the law of Moses, right? And so the same thing applies to Christianity, right? When the new law comes, the law of Christ, right? It might well be that there are some things in there that are different than what was in the old law, right? What might have been okay before is suddenly not okay now, right? Things like concubinage, right? Prostitution. Now, prostitution, even in the law, was not good, right? That's not really an example of something that they were doing that was good, but they were doing it, right? We see Judah and Rahab, right? Now, Paul's not criticizing Abraham for having a concubine. He's not criticizing David and saying, oh, I can't believe he had all these wives, or, that's not what they're saying there. The writer of Hebrews, he praises the faith of Rahab, but no one says, oh man, Rahab was such a faithful lady, so it would be okay for us to have concubines, or it would be okay for us to be prostitutes. No, it's not the same way, right? And the wars of the Old Testament were treated the same way. Yeah, it was okay for them, but we're under a different ethic now, right? The laws that Christ has given for us are different than what they had before, right? It's a small change in a lot of ways, but it's an important one, right? And so early Christians didn't see any conflict between these great men of old, right? Their warlike habits like David and Samson and Gideon, they did all these things. But here now we have these peaceful principles, right? It's even spelled out in Isaiah, right? This was the prophecy that we said that the church clung to and attributed for themselves, right? That they would beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, right? Yeah, they were warlike before, but now we've changed because Christ has brought us into a new way, right? And, Hebrews chapter 11, it goes through these heroes of faith and all these guys, right? And it talks about Gideon and Barak and Samson. Well, actually, it says I can't talk about these guys, right? Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets who by means of faith subdued kingdoms, etc., etc., etc. Then they escaped the edge of the sword. They, out of weakness, were made strong. They became mighty in war. They routed the armies of foreigners. They routed these foreign armies, right? I mean, that's warfare. We know that, right? Their faith was great. They did not receive what had been promised them, right? It was going to be fulfilled in us, right? They were looking forward to our time. They were waiting for us, them to be made perfect through us and the church, and the coming of Christ, right? They were expecting those things, but their behavior is not the model for us, right? It's Christ's behavior that we follow, right? So also, a lot of these guys saw these old wars and such as symbols, right? That they were in a lot of ways foreshadowing of Christ and the cross, right? This battle between good and evil, this battle between God and Satan, between destroying sin. And so what happened is, later on, people start questioning these simple beliefs, right? As time goes by, and you get into the 2nd century, right? People start looking. There's the guy named Marcion. He was a very famous heretic from the 2nd century. And he had this theory that the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament were different, right? That the God of the Old Testament was known as the just God of the Jews, right? He was kind of good. He was fair, but he wasn't altogether good and righteous, right? He wasn't perfect. There was another God that was higher than him that actually made the world, and he didn't know. And the God in the New Testament is different, is better, is about love, right? And so you could see how when you've got a heretic that's trying to break apart things and create all these different gods and saying that the God in the Old Testament is not the God in the New Testament, that people are going to start saying, whoa, 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 what are you doing, right? And so to try to bring those two back together, instead of explaining it properly, they might try to start putting warlike characteristics on the God of the New Testament, right? They're going to say, oh, they start talking about God a little bit differently in the New Testament than we would, right? And so the message of the New Testament starts to change, the interpretation of it, right? Because you're trying to battle against these heretics and you go too far, right? And so when you do that, that puts the central peacefulness of the gospel in danger, right? Because you're in an effort to bind the old and the new together, you pull in too much of the old and put it into the new, right? And that doesn't work, right? Jesus talks about the putting a patch, a new patch on an old garment is going to tear away, right? And so when we get into the early 3rd century, around the 200s, we got guys like Tertullian. He's one of the early Latin writers, one of the first major Latin writers in the church. And others around his time are showing that Christians were using the Old Testament to justify bearing arms, right? To justify going to war, right? And fighting. And this is what we use today. Oh, well, David, right? We look back at these guys and we look at Joshua. But the thing is, they weren't always making the best arguments, right? Because you think about it, they're trying to go against all this stuff of the church and all these teachings of Jesus and the practice of everybody around them, and they're trying to say, well, let's think about it. Okay, yeah, Joshua and the Israelites, but they start saying, some of these guys are saying, well, Moses, he had a rod, right? He had a staff. Aaron, he wore a buckle, right? John the Baptist had a leather belt. So if John the Baptist wore a leather belt, then why can't I have a weapon, right? You see how that doesn't quite make sense? Because Moses had a walking stick, suddenly I can carry a sword, right? These were their arguments that they were trying to make, right? So some of these guys, they weren't thinking it through all the way, right? They were just trying to grasp at some reason to do this, right? They were looking for an excuse. And so that shows you just kind of the level of their thought of these guys that were not following the main teaching of the church, right? And at that same time, though, you've got other Christians that are trying to justify a lot of other things, right? They're justifying going to the public shows, right? Going to going to the chariots, right? Well, because David, he danced, right? David danced before the Lord, so I can go watch these Roman pagan dances and festivals, right? Elijah, he was taken up in a fiery chariot, so why can't we watch the chariot races? These are the kind of arguments that they're making, and you can see that it's not very well thought out, right? They're just looking for an excuse to do this because they're not really very committed to the truth. Now, there's a thing though, right? Because once you get into the 3rd century, there are Christians in the army, right? We saw a few in the book of Acts, right? Cornelius, the Philippian jailer, maybe some people in the Praetorium, right? Paul is teaching and these soldiers are converting, right? So there are Christians in the army, right? But the consensus is that they either got out or they had to deal with problems, right? And to avoid temptation and stay faithful through whatever way they could, right? But when later on you get into the 3rd century and people are trying to say, okay, I want to go join the army. I think this is a good thing, right? Then the Christians can't just say, well, war is always bad, right? We're never supposed to do that. Because, well, the Old Testament wars, we thought the wars were justified, right? And so you can't just say 100% that you can't participate in war, right, as a person, right? Now, you could still say Christians aren't supposed to participate in war, but then you start getting all these questions. Well, what about this? Why is it that they can do this? Or why? It takes more explanation, right? And so if people don't want to listen to the explanation, then they're not going to believe it, right? They're just going to move on. You've also got these thoughts in the mid 200s, guys like Origen. And when he read about the Old Testament wars, he was so opposed to war, he actually tried to turn a lot of the wars into parables and allegories, trying to describe spiritual life, right? Kind of the opposite of what Paul is doing, right? Paul is taking this spiritual warfare and giving it using a military metaphor to describe spiritual warfare. Origen was trying to go back and look at these Old Testament wars and give them a spiritual meaning, right? Sort of to maybe God didn't do that. So again, it was kind of going too far away from these heresies and trying to kind of overcompensate. But on the whole, all of Orthodox Christians considered that those old wars in the Old Testament, those were the will of God, right? Those were God ordained, and God's will for the Hebrews in those, 1,000 years ago is very different than his will for them, right? We've got to follow the teachings of Jesus. That was Orthodox Christianity for 300 years, right? There were exceptions, as we'll get to as we go later on, but that was the bulk of Christian thought. Now, the other type of thing that we can consider is apocalyptic wars, right? We've got these wars in the past, but Christians and Jews are also looking forward to wars in the future, right? You read through Daniel, you read through Revelation, right? God is going to come back and he's going to punish, right? He's going to destroy these, wicked people, these armies of wickedness. The Messiah is going to set up a new kingdom, right? Jesus talks about, you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars, right? He talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, all of that. The Apocalypse, that's the book of Revelation, it's full of these images of war, right? There's the 7 seals that get opened, and the first, the second, and the fourth seal all bring on disastrous wars, right? So it's a book full of warfare, right? And Christians are in some way looking forward to that, right? We're waiting for that to happen, right? This is explaining what's going to happen. And in the end, near the end of the book of Revelation, Christ is pictured, right? He's coming. He's a conqueror. His robe is red. He's got a sharp 2-edged sword coming out of his mouth. I mean, he's powerful in battle, it seems, right? And he's defeating all these enemies of darkness, right? So when we're thinking about Christ in that way, well, some part of warfare is going to be acceptable, right? The great conflict that Christ has, where he's going to defeat the beast and the kings of the earth, and there's a slaughter, right? And all the birds are coming to eat the flesh of the men on the ground, right? I mean, it's a brutal book, right? It's bloody. But then there's the war with Gog and Magog, and the destruction of all the enemies of God, right? Fire raining down from heaven, all this stuff. Just utter destruction of all the enemies of God, right? So this is, that's a war to end all wars, right? And it's going to be fought by our Lord, right? So that's going to change sort of what you think about war and how you talk about it, right? And so one writer after another goes through and discusses these ideas, right? They're looking forward to the coming destruction of evil. They're looking forward to Jesus coming back. And these things are going to happen. But all that being said, the Christian did not see himself as an earthly warrior, right? We're not fighting for the Messiah's victory. We're not going out with swords and things like the Muslims in some of their teachings, where they're going to actually go fight the people and have jihad, right? That's not what we do, right? They believed that those wars would be fought by angelic armies, right? That Christ is the one doing the fighting, right? Or that it's spiritually or figuratively understood, right? Christ, where's the sword? Is it in his hand? No, it's coming out of his mouth, right? A sharp, double-edged sword. That's the word of God, right? That's the word that's going to do this, right? Just like in the armor of God, we got the shield of faith and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, right? This is a different kind of weapon, right? So clearly the battle that's in Revelation, it's not necessarily meant to be a literal interpretation, right? There are a lot of figurative things in there that we can understand. And so it wasn't until the time of Constantine, right, that the success of Christianity appeared to be bound up with military victory, right? All these first 300 odd years, right? The success of Christianity was in spite of persecution, right? They were going through all these things. They were spreading the gospel. It was all about, pressing on against all this suffering. But then when Constantine comes on the scene, then he tries to make it, oh, I saw the sign of Christ in the sky, and he uses that as he's going to fight for God, right? And when he becomes the emperor and he allows Christianity as a legal religion at that point, and then he starts kind of promoting Christianity in some ways, then it gets connected to military victory, right? But even in that case, it's much, much later on before you get an official holy war, right? Where the war is being waged in the name of Christianity itself, right? You get something like the Crusades going off and fighting the Muslims, or you get these wars against barbarians and things like that, fighting to preserve Christianity that way. But that's a long time off, even after Constantine. So when we look at the history, again, we've talked about all this stuff. There's this idea of some warrior Jesus coming back. He's going to conquer his enemies and all of that. But that image never convinced these early Christians to become warlike revolutionaries, right? It didn't convince them to take up arms and do all this stuff for themselves. No, because they were looking forward to the time when Christ was going to do that in the end, right? But for now, they have a purpose. They have how they're supposed to live, and it's not that. They're supposed to suffer through these persecutions and to press on with the gospel and be ministers of reconciliation, right? But again, same thing with the wars of the Old Testament. If you've got this idea that Christ is going to come as a warrior sometime in the future, right, then that's going to prevent you from having this unanimous, uncompromising rejection of warfare as part of Christian life, right? Because warfare is going to be part of it, right? Christ, he's gentle and humble and kind here on earth, but in the future, he's going to come back with a sword, right? There's this kind of contrast there, right? And so you can't just totally come out against warfare in every way, because there are some aspects where you accept it, right? Then, in particular, there's the Jewish War of AD 67 to 71. Right? This is a special case of these apocalyptic wars, right? The ones in Revelation are all in the distant future, right? They seem to be, right? At the end of the age, where all the enemies of God are going to be destroyed, right? But the war around the Jewish war, Jesus predicted that, right? It's in the all of that discourse there in Matthew and Luke, and he's talking about when the temple is going to be destroyed. And it's supposed to come within a generation, right? People are waiting for it, and they have commands, right? Jesus says when you see the abomination that causes desolation, right? Flee to the mountains, right? Don't go back for your coat. Don't go back for anything. Get out of there, right? And so when you go back and you look at Eusebius, who's a church historian in the 300s, he tells us that shortly before the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, all the Christians left, right? There was conflict with the Jews, and there were like 3 or 4 different groups of Jews all fighting against each other. And when the Christians saw what was happening, they all left Jerusalem, right? Because they got a revelation, according to Eusebius. And they got out of there. They went across the Jordan. They went into the land of Pella, of Perea, and they didn't take any part in the fighting, right? Jesus said, flee to the mountains. They got out of town, right? We're not going to have any part in this war because this is a war that God is punishing the Jews, right? That was the unanimous verdict of Christians after AD 70, right? This was a divine punishment that God inflicted on this nation for its sin. They rejected Christ. They crucified him. And so that's what they deserve, right? Because God gave them 40 years to repent, right? Just like they had in the wilderness, right? They had 40 years in the wilderness, right? Kind of once Christianity started, they had about another 40 years to repent of this, of what they did to Jesus. But it didn't happen, and their city was destroyed, right? Their entire religious structure was destroyed. The temple destroyed, never to be rebuilt in the last 2,000 years. War also in the Christian mind, from the Bible, is an instrument of divine justice, right? Christians are looking at the world around them, and they're saying, you know what? God uses war as a punishment, right? If people are sinful, if people are unjust, he's going to punish them with the other nations around, right? Just like this Jewish war was a perfect example, right? Clement of Rome, who's writing about 100, right? He talks about God. He quotes Isaiah, right? Isaiah says, if you're unwilling and will not hear me, the sword will devour you, right? This is a prophecy from Isaiah against the Jews, but he's kind of applying it to everybody. Look, if you're not going to listen, then the sword is going to devour you. You've rejected God, right? You deserve to die. Tertullian, again, in the early 200s, he recounts, God often used the surrounding nations to punish Israel, right? They turn from his laws, they turn to idolatry. What does he do? He sends in the Egyptians, he sends in the Edomites, he sends in the Moabites, he sends in the Assyrians or the Babylonians. All these different nations attacked Israel over and over again as punishment for not obeying God, right? The whole book of Judges is about that. Got Kings and Chronicles detailing all these things, all the prophets telling them over and over again what to do. The curses in the book of Deuteronomy, right? We see all that. Cyprian, also writing in the 200s, he's answering a pagan complaint, right? The pagans are complaining, look, you Christians are, since you Christians started coming around and multiplying, right, there's all these wars and famines and plagues and droughts. It's your fault. You're rejecting our gods, right? Because remember, the Romans and the Greeks, they thought of the Christians as atheists, right? Because they didn't believe in Jupiter and Hera and Zeus and Mercury and, whoever, right? All these different gods. They didn't worship Caesar as a god. They rejected all the gods of antiquity as far as the Romans knew, right? And so they said, look, because there's so many of you and you're rejecting these gods, the gods are punishing us. And Cyprian says, No. These things are happening not because your gods are not worshipped by us, but because God is not worshipped by you, right? The reason all these things are happening is because when we teach the gospel to you, you don't accept it, right? When you hear the truth of God, you don't listen. And so God is punishing you for that, right? He's inflicting all these things, just as he has for time immemorial, right? Now, of course, the belief that God uses war to punish, right? And that those who have been guilty of great sins, God uses war to punish people and those who've been guilty of great sins, right? That doesn't mean that you ought to take part in the punishment yourself, right? Just because you believe that God does that, that doesn't mean that you should be the one to do the punishing. You understand? He says if that were true, then think about this. If because God used war to punish people, it's okay for us to fight in a war, well, God also uses plagues to punish people. He's used persecution to punish people, right? Does that mean that we should spread a plague or persecute our fellow Christians if they're not listening, right? If they're disobeying, well, we'll help persecute you because you're not being faithful, right? Or maybe we'll spread this disease over here because you're not being faithful, and God sometimes uses disease. Does that make any sense to do that? Who's going to say that? That we should, do that? Nobody's going to say that, right? That's absurd to believe that we should persecute other people or spread plagues around just because God uses that sometimes to punish people that are doing wrong, right? So we can't use that same argument for war, right? Because just because God uses war, that doesn't mean that we can take part in it with an easy conscience, right? It's not our job, right? So in the Christian mind, it's a very simple fact. God himself brought about wars, right? So again, this is a difficulty, right? Because we can't just reject war in every sense, universally. I reject war. It's always bad. It's always wrong. Well, it's not, right? Because God has brought them about sometimes. And so sometimes they have to be for God's purpose. They have to be what God commanded, what God wanted, right? So they can't all be universally bad, right? And so this is the difficulty that we're running into, right? There are different ways that Christians accept war, right? Which opens up the possibility, which makes it harder and harder to say, well, you can't have any part with that at all, right? And then there's this, the functions of the state. We talked a little bit about this, but it's good to review it, right? The church, universally, they adopted the view that the state is useful, right? The state is necessary, right? We get this from Paul in the Romans, right? He's saying there's no authority except that which is from God. Those who exist are ordained by God, for rulers are not a terror to the good work, but to the evil, right? So these rulers are there to enforce God's will. They're there by God's authority. They're there to reward good and punish evil, right? The government is important for security. So we don't have all our property stolen or taken, right? To preserve the peace, to punish and prevent certain sins and crimes, right? That's what the government is for. That's what it's there, right? Paul goes on, do you desire to have no fear of authority? Do that which is good, and you'll have praise from the same. For he is a servant of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for he doesn't bear the sword in vain. For he is a servant of God, an avenger for wrath to him who does evil. For this reason you also pay taxes, for they are servants of God's service, attending continually to this very thing. Right? So the taxes pay for the government, the men in the government are dedicating their time and their lives to doing these things. The taxes pay for that. They're doing a service for God, right? They have God's authority. They've been put in that place under God's authority. So if we're thinking about the government in that way, well, then what they do can be, God ordained, right? I mean, that's kind of the argument for Christians, serving under the state to to perform the actions of the state, right? Peter also says submit to every human institution, right? For the Lord's sake. He says honor the emperor, right? I mean, some of these emperors were crazy bad dudes, right? Nero, who would have been the emperor when Peter wrote, he's going to kill Peter, right? But yet Peter says honor the emperor, right? So clearly, just because we're supposed to honor them and submit to them, that doesn't make them good, right? But when you look through all these guys, all these different writers, they're putting forward the idea that civil government has been instituted by God, right? They agree with Paul on that. Clement of Rome, John's Gospel, Polycarp, Athenagoras, the Apocryphal Acts of John, Theophilus, Acts of Apollonius, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Hippolytus, Minicus Felix, Origen, Dionysius of Alexandria, the Didascalia, the Clementine recognitions, Lactantius, Eusebius. So this is 250 years of Christian writing. All agrees that the civil government is there for this purpose. Now, we don't see that in Cyprian and Arnobius, and it might just be they didn't cover that topic, but almost all these guys talk about it. There's only a few don't really mention it. And so when you see that the government is appointed by God, in whatever way that it is, because sometimes it seems a little bit different or seems a little strange the way the government's working, but it recognizes the rightfulness of judicial penalty, right? When you've done something wrong and you're judged as a criminal, even if it's the death penalty, right? That's part of the government's God-given responsibility, right? God gave them the authority, gave them the sword to carry these things out, right? And so that's the right thing to do, right? It's within their power. Irenaeus, again, who's writing about 180, we'll say. He talks about magistrates, judges, right? Wearing the laws as a garment of justice, right? They'll not be punished or questioned for what they do justly and lawfully, right? So he's saying if you judges are following the law, if you're doing what's right, you're not going to be punished for that. You're not going to be questioned about that, right? Because you're just following the law. You're fulfilling your role, right? And I think that's the argument that people like to make today about Christians serving in the army, right? Well, this is the government has this authority. The government has sanctioned this action, right? And so kind of you're wearing the garment of the government's authority, right? You're not acting on your own. You're acting as an agent of the state, so to speak, right? And so you shouldn't be held accountable for that. Well, is that a valid interpretation? Or not? We'll have to talk a little bit more deeply about that, right? But Irenaeus goes on. He talks about earthly rule, right? It's set up by God for the benefit of the nations, the benefit of the Gentiles, right? So that men wouldn't destroy themselves, right? So they would establish laws to control wrongdoing, right? So we don't have anarchy and people just doing whatever they want, wherever they want. That's not going to go well, right? We need some kind of restraint against the more violent actors, right? Tertullian, he tells the Romans, follow your own laws, right? He actually tells them, only use torture until you get the confession that you're looking for, right? If someone's marked for a punishment, it's not right to fight for his acquittal, to deny his crime, right? He's guilty. He's done what's wrong. He needs to be punished for that, right? The Romans should enforce their laws properly, right? Don't let the guilty escape, right? He even talks about gladiatorial fights, right? He says it is a good thing when evildoers are punished. Who but an evildoer would deny that, right? Now, you don't want to take that too much out of context, right? And make it mean something he's not trying to say. He's not saying that it's good that people are, getting thrown into these gladiatorial fights, right? But if someone's doing evil and they're punished for it, then that's good, right? That's what is supposed to happen, right? Now, it would be better if they repented and they were forgiven and given grace and mercy, right? That would be better, right? But it's still good and fair for the evil to be punished, right? And that's what we expect to happen, right? So in as much as that's what was going on in some gladiatorial fights, great, okay? But if it's, you're persecuting people and having people battle to the death for entertainment, that's a very different thing, right? Origen, again, points out persecution is a misuse of the power of government, right? God has given this power for a good purpose, to punish evil, to praise good. If you're going to persecute the good, then you're not performing your function, your proper function in the government, right? You've gone outside of your authority, right? And so we might, again, I think we'll try to talk specifically about just war in a later lesson. But there's this idea, well, okay, maybe the government can have a just war, right? But then we have to ask, well, is the war really just, right? Because if they say it is, if they proclaim it, but then it turns out that it's not really just, right? That you don't have all the facts and that they're going into this and, what happens, right? Is that fair or is that a misuse of power? And if it's a misuse of power, who's guilty, right? That's a problem that we run into, right? But we'll talk about that, I think, more in a later lesson. Origen goes on, he says, the Holy Spirit has given a place for human law in many things, right? It appears that the earthly judge fulfills a very large part of the law of God, right? I mean, you go back and you look at, for instance, the Code of Hammurabi, right? This ancient law code of the king of Babylon, right? A lot of it lines up with the law of Moses, right? There are a lot of things that match up, right? Because things like stealing and murder, we want to avoid those things, right? Adultery in a lot of cases, right? A lot of these different things, they were illegal, right? And they're illegal in our country here because the laws reflect, being able to cooperate. Now, that doesn't mean that all of the laws are right? And that doesn't mean that just following all the laws of the country are going to make you pleasing to God, right? Because there's a lot of things that it might be lacking. But for the most part, earthly judges do fulfill a very large part of the law of God, right? So the other problem with the state, though, is corruption, right? And we see Christians throughout history, even today, complaining about the corruption in the system of justice, right? They recognize the need and value of a good administration, right? We might look at a country that we live in today and we say, hey, there are problems here, right? We need to fix this. Right now it's broken, and if we can fix it, right, a good administration is good, right? If you're acting justly, that's great. But right now it's not, right? And so, Cyprian is complaining, look, there's innocent people that are being condemned by the law courts, right? And that would be bad enough, but you're not even punishing the guilty with them. You're letting the guilty go, right? So you've swapped it. It's like a double corruption. It's even worse, right? Lactantius, he's in the time of Constantine. He's writing, telling Constantine, look, it's your job as the ruler of the nation, of the empire, to correct misdeeds, right? You've got to get these evil men out of the state, right? You've got to get these corrupt guys out, right? So we see these Christians supporting the government, right? Telling the government that it needs to do its job properly, that it needs to get rid of corruption, that it needs to administer its God-given rights, right? And they saw that. And notice what Lactantius also says. He says, take away anger from a king, and not only will no one obey him, but he will even be cast down from his high rank. Now that's kind of interesting, right? So here's this Christian guy, but when he's talking about the king, he's like, he's got to have room for wrath, right? If the king can't be angry and take out his anger on someone with punishment, no one's going to listen to him, right? He's going to not be a king for very long, right? That's an interesting philosophy for someone that, personally, as a Christian, has a very different philosophy, right? But he's kind of looking at two different groups, the church and the king, right? So yes, the government is ordained by God, right? It's right to issue judicial penalties, right? And so in that sense, yeah, there is some rightfulness of war, right? If the government declares a just war and it's for the right cause, then yeah, okay, there's a rightfulness in that they should do that, right? They're protecting people. We understand that, and that's where a lot of the motivation for going to war and serving in the army comes from, because we want to protect the innocent. We want to protect our freedoms. We want to protect our rights. We want to stop evil that's going on, right? And those are all good things, right? Those are noble purposes, and that's what the government is supposed to do. Irenaeus mentions military arts, right? These are among activities generally recognized as useful. People think, hey, the military arts are good. They serve a purpose, right? We could look at Clement of Alexandria. He talks about generalship, right? Serving as a general. He's like, that's kind of like legislation or the administration of justice. These are the usual departments of the royal office, right? If you're the king, you got the government there. You're going to need people to make laws. You're going to need people to administer justice, and you're going to need generals to lead the army, right? That's just kind of what you need in the state, right? Origen talks about the emperor. He says the emperor's soldiers are those who render military service righteously, right? Isn't that interesting, right? These guys that we've seen already that are very opposed to war, themselves as Christians taking part in war, they see the soldiers of the emperor and they're saying, look, you're doing a good job, right? You're offering your righteous service to the country, right? Because as a good Roman, that's what you should do, right? But there's, again, a distinction between the good Roman and the Christian, right? Lactantius, again, around the time of Constantine, he criticizes Maximinus Daza as ignorant of military affairs. He describes his satisfaction and gratitude to God, the victories of Constantine, right? Constantine and Licinius were able to defeat Maxentius and Daza, right? There were these competing Roman emperors at the time in the east and the west, and Constantine was able to win, and Lactantius praised him for it, right? He was very happy that he did win, and so when he writes his church history, right, the last chapters of it, and he's writing his life of Constantine later on, he's got grateful, flattering words in eulogies about this ruler who had overthrown persecutors by force of arms, right? He had secured peace for the church, right? Because Constantine defeated a lot of guys that were really against Christianity, right? And he opened up, got rid of the persecution. So, wow, that's great. We appreciate that, right? And so you can think about these Christians that, they're following the command of Paul and Peter. They're praying for the emperor, right? Honoring the emperor. You're a guardian of the law. You're protecting order, right? And so, we might want to pray for your soldiers to be successful, right? To keep back the barbarians, to keep back these other guys that are coming to do a good job in administering justice, right? That seems like a natural extension of praying for peace, right? But if you go back and you look at the literature, right, these prayers for the rulers start very early, right? We see it there in the New Testament, right? Praying for kings and making intercession. But prayers specifically for the armies don't come around until about 150, 200 years later, right? The time of Tertullian, right? Though by his time, he talks about them as kind of the standard practice, right? You're praying for the emperor, you're praying for his armies to be successful, you're praying for peace altogether, right? So the evidence here clearly shows that Christians believed that God ordained civil government, right? And that their purpose was to restrain sin through force and penalty, right? They had the sword, right? They do not bear the sword for nothing. But they also believed that a Christian must never inflict an injury on his neighbor, no matter how wicked he may be, right? So we got these two things going on, right? For hundreds of years, Christians believed that the government, it was its job to do this and to use force if necessary, but that Christians were not supposed to use force. We're not supposed to hurt their neighbor regardless of how wicked he was. We didn't do that, right? So how do we reconcile these two things, right? How do we reconcile these two facts? First off, being appointed by God to do something does not guarantee the righteousness or innocence of the one doing it. Just because God has given you a job, that doesn't mean that you're a good person, right? The beast in Revelation is given authority over the people and the saints, but that doesn't make him righteous, right? He's the beast. If God uses the wickedness of some people to punish other people and correct other people, that doesn't make them any less wicked, right? It's the wickedness, the wicked actions that they're doing that are actually punishing these people, right? That's what happens. When we think about what Paul is saying, when we think about these early fathers, right, and they're talking about this idea of the just ruler, right, the servant of God enforcing these laws, right? He's punishing wrongdoers, he's waging war against the unrighteous. That's always a pagan ruler, right? He's a pagan. He's not a Christian ruler. He's not expected to obey all the laws of Christian conduct, right? He's just. He can be fair, he can enforce laws and punish wrong, he can wage war, because he's not one of us, right? There's even a statement, I think it's by Tertullian, that says Caesar would be Christian if it was possible for a Christian to be Caesar, right? But it wasn't. So one thing we have to remember here is that not all servants of God are necessarily Christians, right? I mean, just think back to the Old Testament. The Jews were the people of God, right? They had a covenant with God. It was special. They had the law of Moses. They were supposed to follow all these things. But you read the book of Isaiah, it talks about Cyrus, right? My servant, Cyrus. What? Cyrus? He was a pagan king, right? He's a heathen king. King of the Medes and the Persians. How is he a servant of God, right? But he's the one that sent the Jews back to rebuild the temple. He did all these things, right? He was administering justice over this land. He was a God-ordained ruler. He was a servant of God, but he wasn't one of God's people, right? That's a different. He's kind of like a hired servant, you might think, right? So we've got this relative justification, right? It's justified for non-Christians to do this because they're in the government, right? But that's not a model for our conduct, right? That doesn't justify our leaving the teaching of Christ to go and do that, right? That's their job. God gave it to them. He's given a different job to us, right? And someone might say, well, that leaves all the dirty work to non-Christians, right? You're just going to expect all these non-Christians to administer justice, right? You're gonna leave them to do all the policing and do all the war, right? They might make a couple of objections, like, well, how can you trust them, right? Well, maybe you can trust them pretty well, because some of them seem to do a pretty good job, right? I mean, just look at the countries around. There's a lot that aren't ruled by Christians that are doing a pretty good job of justice, right? For, in general, right? The other thing is, we have another purpose, right? And you think about this time, these early Christians, right? You say, oh, they left it all to the non-Christians. Well, but who was enduring all the hardship? Who was enduring all the danger, right? These Christians were being persecuted. They were being killed by the government, by the soldiers, right? So, the dirty work, it doesn't make any sense, right? The Christians were using their influence, right? They had their own method of repressing crime, right? We spread the gospel. We teach about Christ through our example, through our lives, through our teaching. We can change the society around us much better than the state, right? We can go places where the state can't go. We can teach people that the state can't reach, right? And so Christians, our power, right? Our power to reduce the need for the use of force is directly increased to proportion to our number and our zeal, right? The more of us there are, and the more zealous we are to do what Christ wants, right? The more powerful we are at reducing the violence around us, right? And bringing this other stuff down, right? Because we're growing and our influence is spreading, right? And we're sending out the things that Christ has sent us here for, right? And that's good. Now, we're almost finished. We're going to wrap it up here pretty quick, but I want to go through just a couple more slides here. So all these things that we talked about so far are ways that Christians accepted war, right? But none of those actually require Christian participation in war, right? You're just thinking, oh, well, yeah, the wars in the Old Testament, the apocalyptic wars, the government doing this, those are just ways that, yeah, war is okay in a certain sense, right? But it doesn't require me to do anything about it. But the problem is that fact is not always obvious to people, right? And throughout the time period that we're talking about, over hundreds of years, not everybody got the message, right? And, while these guys, they've got these statements of faith, they've got these principles in their conduct, what they actually said and did wasn't always matching up with, the faith exactly, right? So some of them did serve in the army, right? And, but even considering that, there are a couple of cases of apparent compromise, right? Where someone might say, well, I thought you weren't supposed to do that, right? I thought we weren't supposed to sue people, right? So Paul, for instance, right? He demands his legal rights, right? He appeals to Caesar because they're trying to kill him, right? And he's tired of sitting in jail for 2 years, right? So he's not trying to sue anybody. He's just trying to say, hey, I have a right here to not be in jail. I would like to get a fair trial, right? And so he's just seeking immunity from injustice, right? He's not trying to have anyone punished. He doesn't have anything against the Jews, right, that are bringing this case against him. His legal right is just to be set free. And so there's nothing, violent or coercive about that, right? Now, there might be some other cases in Paul's life that we might question his principles, maybe like talking about having, someone cut off or, blinding someone or some different things like that. But it's really hard to measure if he's really being inconsistent, right? There's not much data there. But when you look at these early Christians, right, and again, just like Paul, a lot of them are appealing to magistrates, protesting, right? They're pleading for all these things. But again, they're always the defendants in these early cases, right? They're never asking for the punishment of their enemies. They're asking for protection. They're asking for the government to help them out, right? To not take away their stuff, right? There's a lot of times they're appealing against the government itself, right? So that's a different case. They're not trying to hurt anybody. They're just trying to get left alone, right? Then we've got Origen, right? Again, he's praying for the emperor's victory, right? But we know he's not going to fight alongside them, right? He says, I want you to win, but I don't want to fight with you, right? And so we might say, well, you could recognize maybe that if two people are going to war, one of them winning would be better for you than the other, right? Like we talked about Lactantius. He was happy that Constantine beat these other guys because Constantine got rid of the persecution of Christians, where these other guys would have persecuted Christians even more, right? So you could see where you might want to pray for one side to win over the other, even though really you don't want a war going on at all and you're not going to fight one. But all things being equal, you're going to pray for these guys to win because it's going to work out better in the long run, right? And so we don't know how many Christians really served in political life, right? We don't know how many were judges. We don't know how many sued people in the courts and all this stuff, but we do know it's pretty rare, right? It's not mentioned very much at all before the middle of the 3rd century. So we got a couple hundred years before it really comes in. We get to AD 272, there's actually a synod of Christian bishops that appealed to the emperor to get another bishop kicked out of the church in Antioch. Because he had been condemned as a heretic, but the queen of that, where he was allowing him to stay in the church, right? So here we have an instance where, part of the church is appealing to the government to get a guy kicked out of the church. Now that seems a little strange, right? But again, it's a political thing. But again, that's not until 272 that something like that happens. And we do have in around 280, we find out Christians are starting to be appointed as governors over some provinces. And then once you get to the time of Constantine, and these barriers are taken away, Christianity is legalized. They just start pouring in. But what's interesting is the clergy, right? The priests at that time, they weren't supposed to shed blood. They weren't supposed to administer justice outside of the church. They had a very narrow focus, right? And so there were some Christians that joined in with them. They held back from that. But so many others just kind of took it for granted that Christians were free to serve in the civil government just as the pagans had before, right? But again, that wasn't the position of the early church. That's just what happened after Constantine. When you get this big flood of new Christians coming in, and a kind of different way of thinking, right? And so we have to ask, was that change good? We've got a few more things to talk about next time. We're not done with the Christian approval of war. We're going to get into some actual instances of Christians serving in the army and talk about that.